Munich's night was cold and damp. The rain hung in the air, turning the streetlights into hazy, golden smudges. I dragged my suitcase down the silent streets until I found it, Winters Inn. The building was old, its peeling paint bearing the weight of time. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, and a faint musty scent greeted me, tinged with something floral, subtle, but unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. The lobby was empty except for a middle-aged man behind the front desk. He looked up at me, his gaze lingering a second too long, carrying something unreadable. Slowly, he rummaged through the keys, then handed me one, a tarnished brass key, cool and heavy in my palm. He gestured toward the end of the third floor. The wooden staircase creaked under my steps, each footfall stirring the silence like a house waking from slumber. The hallway upstairs was long and narrow, stretching into the dim glow of a single overhead light. My room stood at the very end, its door marked by a faded brass plate, the numbers worn and nearly illegible. I slid the key into the lock. A dry, grating click. The door groaned open, and the last sliver of light from the hallway was swallowed whole by the room's darkness. Inside, the space was small and unremarkable. The wallpaper was old, stained yellow with age, and faint mold bloomed in the corners of the ceiling. The air was thick and damp, as if someone had lived here for years without ever opening a window. A heavy wooden bed. A single chair. A mirror coated in dust. I peeled off my coat, set my suitcase in the corner, and collapsed onto the bed. The sound of rain outside faded, and the inn settled into an unnatural stillness. I closed my eyes, tried to let sleep take me. But just as my consciousness began to slip, something broke the silence. A whisper. Faint. Muffled. The sound of breath brushing against my ear, just barely audible. My pulse stuttered. I held my breath, straining to make out the words. The voice was hoarse, brittle, tinged with a cold dampness that did not belong to this world.
Did you forget me?
A chill unfurled in my spine, creeping up my neck. My eyes snapped open. The room was still cloaked in darkness. The curtains stirred ever so slightly, though no breeze should have reached them. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, where the wooden chair stood, someone was sitting there. A woman. She was motionless, frail, her tangled hair falling over her pallid face. Her skin had a sickly sheen in the dim light, too pale, too still. Her lips barely parted, as if whispering something just beyond my ability to hear. I lay frozen, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I didn't blink. I didn't move. Somewhere deep inside, I knew if I so much as twitched, she would come closer. Then, in a single desperate motion, I lunged for the bedside lamp. A flood of warm light poured into the room. The chair was empty. I gasped for air, gripping the sheets, my entire body trembling. Just a trick of the mind. Just exhaustion. But then, my gaze drifted toward the mirror. And I saw her, sitting in the chair, exactly as before. Still staring at me. Still whispering.
Did you forget me?
Morning light filtered through the thick curtains, casting soft beams that illuminated the dust swirling in the air. The room looked exactly the same as it had last night, silent, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the empty wooden chair, my thoughts still trapped in the terror of the night before. It hadn't been a dream. I was sure of it. Because she, the woman in the mirror, was still there. Dragging my exhausted body downstairs, I found the lobby as empty and still as before. The man at the front desk sat in the same spot, motionless. As I approached, he lifted his gaze, slow, deliberate, his eyes locking onto mine as if he had expected this. His expression told me everything. He knew what had happened last night. No one in this place wanted to speak of that room. But something deep inside me demanded answers. The innkeeper didn't say much. He simply murmured, almost too softly to hear.
She's been waiting.
A cold weight settled in my chest. I swallowed hard. Waiting for who? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached beneath the counter, pulling out a worn, yellowed notebook. Without a word, he set it in front of me. I hesitated, then turned the brittle cover. The first page bore a name: Helen Winters. A strange unease slithered through my veins as I flipped through the pages. The handwriting was delicate, the ink faded. The early entries were filled with warmth, accounts of quiet days, small joys, and a love story written in the simple moments between two people. But as I read on, the script changed. The writing grew erratic, words pressed deep into the paper as if scrawled by an unsteady hand. There were smudges of water stains, dried into the pages, tears, perhaps.
He's gone. He said he'd never leave. But he lied. He promised. He swore he'd never abandon me. He has to come back.
My fingers trembled. Something about this story felt familiar in a way that sent a sickening twist through my stomach. And then I reached the final entry. The handwriting was no longer delicate. It had become jagged, almost violent, as though clawed into the paper.
Did you forget me?
A sharp pain erupted in my skull. A sudden, piercing ache, like something buried deep inside my mind was trying to force its way back into my consciousness. Flashes of memory. Fragments of a night, long ago. A shadow in the rain. A woman grabbing my arm, pleading, tears streaming down her face. And me, pulling away. Turning my back. Walking into the night, leaving her behind. The air in the room plummeted to an icy chill. And then, a whisper. Soft. Fragile. So close to my ear.
Did you forget me?
The pain in my head was unbearable. I snapped my gaze toward the mirror, and my breath caught in my throat. She was no longer sitting. She was standing, and she was walking toward me. My temples throbbed violently. My vision swayed, consciousness unraveling like torn fabric, flickering with fragmented images, streets, rain, a crying woman, the elongated glow of streetlights stretching across wet pavement. A weight crushed against my chest, an invisible hand tightening around my throat, choking the air from my lungs. Helen. Why do I remember that name? My trembling fingers brushed over the last page of the diary. Cold sweat seeped through my shirt, tracing icy trails down my spine. The lobby was silent, so unnaturally still that the very air felt suffocating. A pressure, unseen but heavy, pressed down on me. My fingertips hovered over the fragile paper, hesitant, unwilling, terrified to turn the page. But it was already happening. It was coming back. 5 years ago. A night of rain. I stood on an old street in Munich. Helen clutched my wrist, her fingers icy, desperate. Raindrops mingled with her tears as they rolled down her pale face. Her eyes. They were filled with terror. With despair. With something deeper, something I couldn't face. I felt suffocated. Trapped. I needed to get away. So I pulled away. I turned my back on her. And I walked. I didn't look back. Somewhere behind me, at the end of the street, the roar of an approaching engine drowned out her sobs. My footsteps quickened, heels slapping against the wet pavement. My breath came short, erratic, my pulse hammering wildly against my ribs. Then, she called my name. One last time. A voice that split the night. A scream that tore through my skin, leaving behind something raw and open. Then, tires screeched. Metal twisted. A hollow, deafening impact. Then, darkness. Everything after that was blank. I woke up in a hospital bed. The doctors told me I had been in a serious accident. A car crash. The impact had caused partial memory loss. I tried to remember, tried to piece together the gaps to recover what had been taken from me. But every time I reached for it, it slipped away, like ink dissolving in water, bleeding into nothingness. And now, it had returned. My stomach lurched. I doubled over, nausea twisting inside me like a blade. That night, my silhouette had vanished into the darkness. And Helen had never left. I stared at the words carved into the paper, etched so deeply they threatened to pierce through my skin. The handwriting, jagged, raw, bled across the page like an open wound. I shot to my feet. The chair screeched against the floor, the sound splitting through the suffocating silence. I gasped for air, chest heaving, as the room began to warp. The ceiling stretched higher, impossibly distant. The walls folded inward, pressing close, suffocating. A sickly perfume tainted with decay filled the air, thick and damp like something dying. My eyes snapped to the mirror. The wooden chair was empty. Helen was gone. But I wasn't alone. She was behind me. Her reflection towered over mine, her elongated shadow pressing against my back. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Ice crawled through my veins, locking my limbs in place. Blood stopped. My mind froze. Helen's breath brushed against my ear. Cold. Wet. Rotten. Her voice slithered through my skull, sinking into my very being.
You finally remember. My darling.
A violent tremor ripped through the space around me. The room's lighting flickered, turning a sickly, distorted white, like light struggling to break through deep, murky water. My balance faltered. I stumbled backward, reaching instinctively for the table. But my fingers grasped nothing. The world beneath me collapsed. I crashed onto the floor, weightless, my limbs sluggish, as though some unseen force had taken control. Then, the door silently swung open. The innkeeper stood in the doorway, watching. His face was shrouded in shadow, his expression unreadable. Only his eyes, cold, impassive, gleamed faintly in the dim, shifting light. There was no surprise in his gaze. He had been waiting for this.
Helen is my daughter.
His voice seeped through the air, low, heavy, thick with time itself. An undeniable force, absolute.
She has waited long enough.
The final flicker of light died, and the world turned black. A wind blew. From nowhere, whispers seeped from the cracks in the walls. The mirror shuddered, and Helen moved, her reflection no longer bound to the glass. She stepped forward, emerging through the darkened surface as though pulling herself through twisted, rippling water. A force dragged me closer. The blackness around me churned, the walls melting into shifting, liquid shadows. I fought it. I fought with everything I had. But something held me down, chains I couldn't see, an anchor I couldn't break. My legs refused to move. Helen reached out. Her fingers broke through the glass like it was nothing but air, stretching toward my wrist. The moment her skin met mine, a deathly chill shot through my veins. I shuddered. She smiled. Not cruelly. Not viciously. But with quiet, final satisfaction. Her fingers tightened. And then, she pulled. The floor beneath me vanished. My consciousness plummeted downward, into nothingness. The world collapsed into black, swallowing me whole. The air turned thin. And as I drifted into the void, I felt them. Countless lips, brushing against my skin, whispering,
You're finally home, my love.